Listen. The child grew, and on the day of weaning, Sarah and Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah noticed the child that Hagar the Egyptian had borne for Abraham, playing with her child Isaac. She demanded of Abraham, "Send Hagar and her child away. I will not have this child of my attendant share in Isaac's inheritance." Abraham was greatly distressed by this because of his son Ishmael. But God said to Abraham, "Don't be distressed about the child or about Hagar. Heed Sarah's demands, for it is through Isaac that descendants will bear your name. As for the child of Hagar the Egyptian, I will make a great nation of him as well, since he also is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham brought bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar. Then, placing the child on her back, he sent her away. She wandered off into the desert of Beersheba. When the skin of water was empty, she set the child under a bush and sat down opposite him, about a bowshot away. She said to herself, "Don't let me see the child die." And she began to wail and weep. God heard the child crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. "What is wrong, Hagar?" the angel asked. "Do not be afraid, for God has heard the child's cry. Get up, lift up the child, and hold his hand, for I will make of him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went to it and filled the skin with water, and she gave the child a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became a fine archer. He made his home in the desert of Paran, and his mother found a wife for him in Egypt. Here ends this morning's reading.
Presbyterians are not supposed to believe in karma, but there's some law of the cosmos that whenever I set up a sermon series with the intent of not being political, great stories of Genesis, something happens in the world that the sermon text addresses. We're looking at the story of two women and their children. One of them is the ancestor of Judaism, and the other is the ancestor of Islam. As you know, this week there was a shooting in New Zealand, and it's both a tragedy, but it's also something that is almost inevitable. When Christians talk about Islam in the way so many of our fellow self-called Christians do, that when you vilify someone, when you paint a target on their back, there's responsibility for what happens from that. So I want us to go into this story. It looks like one of those stories that preachers should just avoid. And it is. Most preachers do not preach on this story because it looks so bad. It sounds so cruel. But what we have to understand about these stories is they come from an oral tradition. This is before Scripture was written down. This was a community conversation. When Scripture began, it was never the last word. It was always the first word in the conversation. And as people went around the circle, they looked at the story in different ways. We don't think of it this way, but we are born into stories. You were born into your parents' stories. You may not even know what all of them are. But when you were a child, you could feel yourself bumping into things that were dynamics that you didn't understand, but you knew, okay, the current's going this way here. I better go someplace else. There were expectations for you. There were fears that people had that you just were born into. And this is true of the culture, it's true of the country, and it's true of the religion. By getting together in community and thinking about these stories, we go more deeply and profoundly into our own humanity. It's the conversation that matters. We don't know how much of the story is true, how much of it's made up. But when we tell the story, it takes us more deeply and profoundly into our stories. The thing about the oral tradition is, if stories didn't matter in people's lives, people forgot them. It's the stories that survive for thousands of years that teach us who we are in a way that's sometimes impossible to find on our own devices. Once you write Scripture down, you're already in trouble, because it's not going to grow ever again. So you have the responsibility of then filtering and sifting through. So we're going to look at this story. We're going to see what it teaches us about our humanity. But we have to realize that Scripture is not written with good people fighting bad people. The way these stories are lived out it's very complicated. Everybody's doing the best they can do. Everybody in the story has a different interpretation that's going on. And it's those deeper dynamics that the story takes us to. Sometimes we discover about ourselves that we're living somebody else's life. We're living out somebody else's story. In fact, I would suspect that every one of us at some point realizes, I'm living out expectations that I didn't choose. I'm avoiding fears that I've never really experienced. And I need to take claim of my own life, of my own thoughts and my own feelings. If we're lucky, we can realize that about other people too, that I'm projecting my stories onto somebody. Have you ever known somebody who married somebody for certain traits and they get married and those are the very traits that irritate them then? Somebody that married somebody to fit into their story, to be furniture in their house. Those are good stories to outgrow. And one of the things Scripture does is help us outgrow the stories that are no longer helpful. Abraham is not a role model. Abraham, and really in the Jewish tradition, nobody was a role model. Right? At some point you realize, okay, it's all bozos on this bus. Right? Because it's your life. You're not going to find who you are by imitating somebody else. So in this story, Abraham, early on when they first go to Egypt, he thinks, okay, Sarah's very pretty. So Sarah, I want you to claim to be my sister. So the Pharaoh will take you into the harem and I'll be safe. Now, does that sound like a courageous person to you? And he's going to be conflict avoidant throughout his whole life. And I relate to that. I understand. He's not helpful in dealing with the conflicts that are going to happen. He just wants everybody to be happy and not mad at him. So, in this story, Hagar represents someone who is enslaved, and she becomes a surrogate because Sarah can't have children, or Abraham, not sure which. She gets impregnated. When Sarah has children of her own, she doesn't need Hagar anymore. And Ishmael, the product of that relationship, is now a threat to the son that she has had, Isaac. Now that's very complicated, but life is like that sometimes. And you can understand how every person in the story would get to that point. Right? You understand how everybody would wind up in that kind of a trap. But what's interesting is the Jewish thinker that put this story together puts this story right before the story about the sacrifice of Isaac, where he's presented as the only begotten son. Do you remember that? And this is why preachers skip the story. Right? Because somebody planted a little hand grenade in that story to the idea that we're better than other people, that our lineage is pure. Can you see the brilliance that's here? Right before there's going to be the story of the special child that is, only begotten one. Here's Ishmael. What about Ishmael? Somebody is trying to get the Jewish community to think about the thrown away people, the people that didn't fit in the story. And what you'll find time and time again when you look at these stories is it raises your question. When Isaac is going to be sacrificed, they talk about the knife going against the throat. You're not supposed to identify with that sacrifice, right? You're supposed to be repulsed by it. I mean, you'd leave the story of the knife out. You'd leave the story of this captive, enslaved person that you impregnated and now you don't need anymore. And you throw him out in the desert. U.S. foreign policy, 4,000 years ago. Right? We needed Guatemala. We needed the resources. We needed to unsettle it. We destroyed the culture. We plunged it into chaos. And now the refugees come, and we called them criminals. And so a church has to protect somebody because they understand there are no throwaway people. The story takes us deeper into our humanity where we can have that kind of an experience of realizing the abomination of thinking they're throwaway people, or that your life can hit a dead end. What can happen is your story can break, but the life within you never has a dead end. The story's going to try to say that. Now, here is this enslaved woman who's been thrown away. She's given a canteen of water and bread. And in the story, in oral tradition, there's lots of contradictions in the story, so you're not supposed to notice that. But if you're following the story before, Ishmael is a teenager, and suddenly he's an infant again. Don't think about that. It's like in a movie. It's like that's not the point. The literal level of the story is not the point. Imagine an infant. Not somebody 4,000 years ago, but in your life. And a woman who is in such despair that she would rather, it says she flung the child under this bush and moved away so she wouldn't watch it die. Now that's a story that's repeated all up and down the Southwest as refugees fleeing violence perish in the deserts of the United States. This is not a long ago story. It's happened since the beginning of humankind. And the story calls you in or out of that. Are you a member of that empire, or are you a resistor of that empire? An angel comes to the rejected ones. Do you realize what that's saying? God is not on our side over and against the other side. If these are Arabs, if these are Muslims, an angel of God is going to them, saying, don't despair. Have you ever noticed how many times when angels talk, they just say, don't be afraid? That's what this one said. Some preacher told me one time, you can never believe what preachers say, you have to check it out. But they said that the words, do not fear, are found 365 times in Scripture. Now, I don't care enough to check it out, but the point is that religion is not intended to frighten you, right? The people that wrote that did not come up with hell. That's something the church came up with much, much later. Do not fear. Listen to the words of the angel. Now, realize that an angel, that word just means messenger. This could have been anybody. And if somebody has to have wings on their back before you'll be open to the sacred, you're probably going to have a pretty long, dry road. It says this, do not be afraid, though things seem hopeless. And this is said to like the refugee. This is told to the throwaway person. This is the enemy. Do not be afraid, though things seem hopeless. Take the child in your arms. I have heard his cries. I will save him and will make of him a great nation. See, the same thing that's going to happen to Abraham and that family is going to happen to these castaways. The same love that steers who we think are the good people is as much behind who we think are the bad people. We have to get deeper than that. Now, like most people, she's given an idea of life that's very narrow and very limited. That's what religion can be. It says she has a skin of water, a canteen of water. The word for water is plural. Now, that's the way the Hebrew played out. But the point, what triggers when you listen to that is not just a canteen of water. It's the waters of life. And I think that's when the angel, it says, in our translation, it says opened her eyes. In the Hebrew, it says unclosed her eyes. I think there's an important difference there. What she was looking for was all around her. The sacred is all around us. But when we're looking for it in a particular religious definition, within a particular story, we may walk right by it. A lot of times people come by and say, do you believe in the afterlife? And I never know how to answer that, because if there is an eternity, it's already started. Right? If there's an eternity, it's already started. So why are you waiting to die before you answer that question? Right? That's not the question. The question is, can you be alive now? And what I've realized about these angelic stories that are in Scripture is it's not the messenger, it's the message. And it's not the message, it's the awareness, the interconnectedness, the trust. Because if it has to have wings on its back, you're not going to have a whole lot of visitations. Or at least I haven't. Whatever the message is for a particular situation. But the awareness, the trust, the sense of interconnectedness can be with you always. And this is the experience she has, a mystical experience of the fountain, the water being everywhere. When Muslims go to Mecca, they recreate Hagar looking for water. And then realizing that the miraculous is all around us. In the story, God can speak to everybody. They can't speak to each other. They can't make it work. But there is a love and a depth which can work. And the story is calling us to dwell in that depth. where it's not story against story, where we can hear each other's stories. And even if they don't jive with one another, even if we can't reconcile them in any way, shape, or form, we can still live on the same planet in love and harmony. The rabbis look at Hagar in a very radical way. She's not a throwaway person. Many of the rabbis say that she was the daughter of Pharaoh. She was royalty. And when Sarah dies, Abraham marries again. And there's rabbinical traditions that say that was Hagar. That Hagar in Hebrew means stranger, wanderer. And the name that's given in the story is Keturah, which means incense, sweetness, beauty. There is a goodness in life that's just there, that may not be fulfilled in your individual story. Right? Life is too crazy sometimes. It can feel like a desert, but what the story is telling you is this interconnectedness, this love, this depth, whatever it is that you imagine it, however you imagine it, can be there always and all the time. The little boy, Ishmael, that means God hears or hears God. The boy was a prophet. He could hear God in the story. Now that's the parent of Islam. So if you go into the story itself and you don't listen to religionists trying to turn it into something sectarian, it calls us to our human family. One rabbi said, Ishmael did not fit in the covenant, but he fit in the promise. And the promise is deeper and broader than the covenant. That's a Jewish person affirming the relationship with Islam. Listen to an Islamic, which is what makes it so sad when you have leaders of a country that are so deeply ignorant, so deeply and profoundly ignorant of other people, that you know have never read another scripture in the whole world, probably haven't read our own scripture. 2 Corinthians, what was it that... We can't let these people do violence in our name. We have to get loud. As Christians, loud in defense of our Jewish friends, of our Muslim friends, of our atheist friends. We have to stop being guilty bystanders. This is how Muslims in the Quran talk about this particular relationship. They go, say, O Muslims, we believe in Allah and that which is revealed unto us, and that which revealed unto Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes, and that which Moses and Jesus received, and that which the prophets received from God. Now listen to this. This is Islam. We make no distinction between any of them. And unto God we have surrendered. Why do we only talk about Muslims as terrorists? Why isn't somebody who professed some Christian beliefs and white supremacist beliefs, isn't it time to start calling that terrorism too? Isn't it time to call the Iraq War state terrorism? Doesn't your humanity call you to that truthfulness and that prophetic speech? There has to be a depth of compassion that results in treating people differently, that realizes there are no dead ends. We sometimes get lost in our stories, but every one of us is important. And no throwaway people. We had a wonderful event yesterday in the parking lot. Different ministries in town came together and they had showers for people who are homeless. They had free meals. They had chiropractic. They had setting up for dental care down the future. And I went out, and one of our clients that comes here a lot, was sitting there getting a haircut, getting her hair styled. And she was sitting there bawling. Can you understand why? She was remembering her dignity. Because she has to live in other people's stories about who she is. How many people have to live in shadows in this culture and simply want to be seen for their humanity? Ilda and Yvonne are treated like criminals because their country was destroyed and they didn't stay there to die. And the people that destroyed it are calling them names. And the church needs to get furiously angry. Not out of hatred, but out of compassion and out of the duty to protect the innocent. Did you hear the speech by the Prime Minister of New Zealand? My God, I wish we had leadership like that. Listen to this. See if you can remember when leaders had dignity and humanity. She says, "It is clear this can only be called a terrorist act." Why doesn't our president say that? Why do we have an entire political party that's profiteering off of Islamophobia and vilifying other people? Are they not guilty for the target they painted on someone's back? She says many of those who have been directly affected by this shooting may be migrants to New Zealand. They may even be refugees here. They have chosen to make New Zealand their home. And it is their home. They are us. The person who has perpetrated this violence against us is not. They have no place in New Zealand. There is no place in New Zealand for such acts of extreme and unprecedented violence, which it is clear this act was. We, New Zealand, were not a target because we are a safe harbor for those who hate. We were not chosen for this act of violence because we condone racism, because we are an enclave to extremism. We were chosen for the very fact that we are none of those things, because we represent diversity, kindness, and compassion. A home for those who share our values, refuge for those who need it. And those values will not and cannot be shaken by this attack. We are a proud nation of more than 200 ethnicities and 160 languages. And amongst that diversity, we share common values. And the one we place the currency on right now is our compassion and support for the community of those directly affected by this tragedy. And secondly, the strongest possible condemnation of the ideology of the people who did this. You may have chosen us, but we utterly reject and condemn you. Now, that's not hatred of individuals. That's identifying hateful speech and hateful acts. Love demands that we do that. It's not loving to leave somebody unconfronted and unchallenged when they're lost in a bad story, a story that hurts other people. Scripture teaches us it's not good people versus bad people, but it is dangerous people versus safe people. What our story today tells us, reveals to us from the inside out, is that we can take religion out of the canteen we were given. We realize that the sacred is everywhere. It's not the property of any one religion or any one nation. And so there are no dead ends. There's hope for us all. And finally, when we step out of the stories that we were given, the roles that don't feel right to us, the fears we have that are not really coming from our own experience. When we step out of that stories, that we recognize that all of humankind is our family, and there are no throwaway people. I invite you now to your own reflection on these words.